To discuss these recent events and ways to curb abuse on the field, we welcome Ged Grebby. He is the founder and chief executive of the organization called Show Racism the Red Card. He joins us from Newcastle. Also in the United Kingdom, joining us from Birmingham, Gubba is a documentary filmmaker and football historian. Moving to the other side of Europe, in Vienna, we have Dario Brentin, a researcher at the University of Graz. And here with me is communications professor at Howard University, Chico Onwumechili. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Gubba, let me start with you in Birmingham. Racism in football is nothing new. It's been around for generations, but it is getting a lot of attention right now. And we just heard that German journalist say in our report there that it is getting worse. Do you believe that it is getting worse?
Yes, thanks for having me on your show, Ananad. I definitely agree. It's getting, it's not getting worse, but it's still very prevalent, and it's rightly in the public domain, and it really deserves the zero tolerance that we've heard about. One of the people that speaks the most sense about this, I think, is the former England and Liverpool footballer John Barnes, and he talks about education and a social problem. And even though a lot of people might describe themselves as not being racist, you know, a lot of people are naturally brought up to think in a racist way. Even if we think about what's happened over the last 3 years with politics, it even comes into the Brexit vote. I mean, some people have voted for Brexit because of racist inclinations, I think. That's my belief.
Yeah, John, you know, you talk about politics changing in the world. I mean, is this kind of racism that we see on the football field, is it more prevalent in some parts of the world than others?
I think it's definitely more prevalent in some countries. I mean, England has actually made a lot of great strides, but countries like Italy and Germany have been guilty of racist behaviour quite a lot down the years. And England footballers have found it when they've gone to places like Montenegro, as we've seen recently, and Raheem Sterling and other players like Danny Rose have been victims of racist abuse. But it goes back a lot further than this, of course, and even going back 24 years ago last week when Eric Cantona did his famous kung fu kick and came up with the seagulls and the trawlers quote. That was sparked by racism because his, you know, Eric Cantona's mother was criticised by a football hooligan, and you don't have to be a black or coloured player to be the subject of racist abuse. So I think it's all players who are not from the home country are subject to potential racist abuse.
All right, let's go to Vienna, to Dario Brentin. And Dario, there were several incidents during the recent England-Montenegro game, but there seemed to be little acknowledgement of what had taken place on the field, little or no reckoning of what the players had faced on the field. Is there a risk here that there is some acceptance of what is taking place and that this could, I guess, become the new normal?
Well, I certainly don't hope that it's going to become the new normal. And I would say that British media in particular was very vigilant in how it reacted to the racist abuse of Hudson-Odoi, Rose and Raheem Sterling. And I'd wish, and I'm not the only one who's expressing this, that they would be equally vigilant when it comes to racism in British football itself, not just when it happens outside of the UK. We just had a survey made by ITV last week that clearly stated that black and Asian players on the grassroots level in England still overwhelmingly experience racism whilst playing football. I guess it was in the high 70s, the percentage of players who expressed that they've witnessed or that they've been victims of racist abuse, with I think 45% saying that it happened only during the last year. So I certainly don't hope that this becomes the new normal. I think we have to be vigilant as media people, as academics, as football fans and activists in order to thematize that, problematize that, and find solution to this prevalent problem.
Ged Grebby, of course, football organizations, officials, governing bodies, they're all looking at ways to stop this scourge. I mean, one of the options being looking at is to stop a match when a player is racially abused. This is what some managers had to say about that. Let's watch this.
We could do that. So we have football is a strong weapon. In the not nice words to say, is a strong, you know, weapon to defend the principles of humanity.
We have to find ways to punish these guys, to get them out. But we have to make clear that's not allowed, and that's not possible. And yeah.
So, Jed, that was Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola talking there. Stopping a game is one thing, but is that a realistic option? Could not, you know, some fans actually take advantage of that, stopping a game when their team is losing, for instance?
No, I think if it's done in the right way by the referee and the announcements made on the TANI system and the players and the management are made aware of it, it's a very effective way of making that statement that racism is no longer acceptable within football. And I think we have got to the stage when you've got managers saying these things, and certainly the England manager Gareth Southgate made that point after the Montenegro racism, that we do have to make a really strong stand now. Countries like Italy in particular have had 25 years to start the campaigns that we've had in England for the last 25 years. And they're no further forward now than they were 25 years ago. So we do need, I think, a stronger action in certain countries.
John, what are your thoughts on that? Will that work?
I think we have to look at the prospect of stopping games, but I think it's important that we're not relying on the players to stop and walk off the pitch. I think it's important that the referee takes the lead in this case. And it's okay having all these campaigns and directives, but unless the referee decides that, you know, the fans have overstepped the mark and he's going to take the players off the pitch, I think at the end of the day we'll always get these controversies, and the media will always be 100% supporting the fact that we shouldn't have racism in sport. But unless we actually see some real action and matches being interrupted, and I think the referee really needs to take the lead in some of these cases. That's what I believe.
All right, let me bring in Chuka. He's right here with me in the studio. Chuka, of course, these are big challenges. There are rules in place. The chairman of the English Football Association talked about the current rules that are in place, and this is what he said. Let's listen.
The protocol asked the referee to stop the match if racist behaviour is of a strong magnitude and intensity. I now don't think that's good enough. I understand the protocol was designed for mass chanting, but receiving a torrent of vile racist abuse from one person when you're taking a throw in a corner is wholly unacceptable too. So we should look again at our definitions to make sure that the protocol covers this, because this needs to stop.
So, Chuka, I mean, there is an assessment that the referee has to make there, and in the words of the chairman of the English Football Association, he has to make that assessment that there is racism of a strong magnitude and intensity. Is that putting a big burden on a referee? I mean, he's got to referee a match as well.
I think it's a burden, but it's a burden that should be taken. Yeah. One thing that is a little bit sad about this is that this rule's been there for a while, but I don't recall a game that the referee has stopped yet. And yet we have racism, this chanting against players that's been going on for years, and not one game's been stopped. The last game that I know that was aborted goes back almost 6 years, which was a friendly game in which I think it was Kevin Prince Boateng. They were playing a friendly game, and there was a lot of abuse. And he took it upon himself to walk out of the field, and his teammates followed him.
That was a long time ago.
That's a long time ago. Yeah. So I think that the referees, if they're going to have this burden, they've got to act. They can't say that they can't act. But I also agree with the FA chairman saying that there is more that needs to be done. Yeah. This is really scratching the surface.
Ged Grebby, is that a fair point? Rules are there, but they haven't been used.
Yeah, it is a fair point. I definitely think you know, the authorities have had the action to take, but there hasn't been enough action taken. So we do need to look at the protocol again and make sure that when racism's happening on the pitch, that it isn't left to the players to walk off. I totally agree with that point. It has to be the officials taking the action, and it has to be done in conjunction with the rules and making sure the TANI announcements are made. But I believe we've made a huge progress in England in terms of fighting racism, and that message has to now go into the rest of Europe and the world. I think progress has been making, but we do need that to go in particular to Eastern Europe into Italy.
John Gubba, talking about players walking off the field, the former Tottenham defender Pascal Chibolda, he says that appeals from governing bodies or officials or campaigns with slogans, they're not going to work. Players walking off the field, that's what's going to work. What do you make of that?
Yeah, as I said before, I don't think the responsibility should be left with the players having to take the lead. I think the end of the day, the referee's there to protect the players. And I think, as was mentioned by my colleague there, you know, no matches are being stopped when these racist abuses are happening. So until we actually see matches being interrupted and stopped temporarily while, you know, the point is made, I don't think we're going to see any progress in that direction. But I think going back to the points made by John Barnes, who's been quite vocal about this, I think it's down to education. And okay, we're making good progress in the UK, but it is a cultural thing, and there's a lot of people who are naturally racist, even though they think they're not racist. Unfortunately, the tendency, it's like we had this story a while back with Liam Neeson, the Hollywood actor, right. And he admitted that he was racist, and he got abused for that. But the thing is, he acknowledged the fact that he was wrong to be that, and he made a good point. And John Barnes said he deserves a medal for saying that, because he's admitting what a lot of people won't admit, that they are actually brought up to be naturally racist. I think that is the problem. People are not admitting and not facing the problem.
Dario Brentin, players who are the targets of abuse, they under enormous stress, under enormous pressure. There was an incident just a few days ago when a Juventus player was subjected to consistent racial abuse on the field, and then after scoring a goal, he stood in front of those taunting fans, the fans who were abusing him, with his arms outstretched. That prompted even more racial abuse. Now some are blaming the player for being part of this. Is that fair?
No, that's certainly not fair, and victim blaming is really not in place here. Moise Kean is certainly the victim here, and I mean, one could see from the reactions that players like Raheem Sterling, the reactions of support, that's the way that we have to support players like him. And since you mentioned the pressure that players are under, Danny Rose just today gave an interview, a heartfelt interview that should make all of us ashamed, that he feels that he doesn't want to play football anymore because of the lack of results in the way that football is tackling racism. So the mental health aspect of this entire situation with ongoing racist abuse is something that is still pretty much or has not been spoken enough about. So from my point of view, there's the only way of how one can confront racists is by actually doing that, and that's something that Keane did, in my opinion, and not just shrug it away and pretend that nothing happened.
Ged Grebby, that interview that Dario talks about, that was an interview in which Danny Rose did say that he can't wait to get out of soccer because of the racism. Is there a risk that this could have a long-term effect on the game, you know, especially with young players, black players, coming through the ranks?
Absolutely. I mean, just this week we've had a game in Leicester abandoned because of racism. So at the grassroots level in England, we're seeing what we're seeing in English society and in the UK society, which is a growth of racism over the last 5 years, a doubling of race hate crime in the UK in 5 years. So it's bound to come back into football. It's not, you know, racism is not football's problem, it's society's, and we're seeing it coming back in. And the fact Danny's had to say that, I think, is a wake-up call for a lot of people. But it shouldn't take somebody like him saying it. We should be listening to the grassroots of the game where, as I say, games are abandoned. Last week, a young black player in Ipswich said he didn't want to play the game again. It didn't get the kind of headlines Danny got, but it was he's a young 16-year-old player not wanting to play football again because of racist abuse in that particular area of England.
Chuka, Pep Guardiola, the manager of Manchester City, that is, he says the issue is just not confined to soccer. He says there's a racist culture in society right now. It's becoming sharper in some parts of the world, especially in Europe, which is facing problems with immigration from parts of Africa and the Middle East. This makes it a much bigger problem, doesn't it?
It's a big problem. There's no doubt about that. To me, I see it as a cultural problem. And as the manager mentioned, the fact is that it's been on increase. As a matter of fact, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, I looked at a website of one of the organizations that have been fighting this problem in football, which is to look at football against racism in Europe, which is fair. They chart number of reports that they get every month. This past month in February, they charted no less than 30 reports for 1 month about racist actions in football venue. Now, because this is a cultural problem, I think the way to solve it is something that is much deeper, that could also be long-term, which is these organizations right now are using things like education, which is fine, because that helps in prevention. But also there has to be some sanctions, really much more harsh sanctions. I give you an example of what I mean. Last year, the Greek Football Federation was sanctioned. But how much were they sanctioned? For $8,000 for a racist act? I mean, that's a slap on the wrist. That doesn't go far enough. There's got to be sanctions that people think about and understand that they can't act this way. So I think it's really a multi-approach that should be used because it's cultural, and also approach that's got to be harsher than it is right now.
Yeah, John Gubba, you were talking earlier about John Barnes. I mean, one of the solutions he has been looking at is, and as you mentioned this, was education, especially education of young people. Yet we do have players who are trying to handle this in their own way, some of it very controversial. Raheem Sterling decided to tweet emojis of monkeys after he faced abuse on the field, saying that that was the way we can call attention to this and make people aware of what they're doing. Is something like that going to work?
I think Raheem Sterling has been very brave in the way he's tackled the racist problem, and I think part of the problem has been caused as well, but even though the media supports the campaign against racism, they haven't helped by not really promoting Raheem Sterling as a role model for black players. He's a player who's, in my opinion, has received a lot of abuse for the fact that he's been successful, and things that have nothing to do with football, where his reputation and his image has been tarnished by the media, and that in turn has sparked people to be more racist when they see Raheem Sterling in a football match. So I think he's very brave to take a strong reaction against racism, and he's having to take extreme measures, which is brave of him because he's taking on the fight, and that's probably going to trigger more racism against him. But I think it needs people like Raheem Sterling, who is very high profile and one of the best players in Europe at the moment. And I think he needs a lot more credit and praise from the media as a human being, not just as a football player. And I think that's part of the problem, where the media has painted his image in the wrong way. And I think that's had a negative effect when it's come to racism.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think, John, one of the things that I also see is you just pointed out a very important point, which is this is not just about football itself and on the field. This is, as we've mentioned previously, is a cultural problem. He's just mentioned the media issue. But even when you look at the clubs themselves, the institutions themselves, because racism is not just individual racism. There is institutional racism and structural racism. You look at the appointment of coaches in football at the elite level. You look at the leaders of football, that's the back room, not the front room that people get to see in the stadium. Mm-hmm. There is this systemic racism and structural racism that exists in that. All of these things need to change. And those are the kinds of things that exemplify to the ordinary people that come to the stand that these things are not accepted. So football still has a long way to go. It's not simply fighting racism, the one that we see on TV from fans. It's also fighting racism in the back room.
Dario, what do you make of that? That, the people who run football need to lead by example.
Well, I think we've mentioned several aspects and several leeways into tackling the issue, and I think all of them are right, because we need a multi-level approach. We need ambassadors like Raheem Sterling who openly tackle and talk about the problems of racism at the highest elite level. We also need commentators and former footballers like John Barnes, like Garth Crooks, and so on, to voice their opposition to the status quo. But The only thing that I'd say that whilst there are financial sanctions in place, yes, they could be stricter, but there are some. I honestly do not see enough education being enforced by UEFA and by FIFA onto the national and the club level. Yes, there are certain clubs that lead by example. Borussia Dortmund is often mentioned as a club that has done a lot of work with their fans, where obviously the situation is not perfect, but they've invested a lot into anti-discrimination programs and have become a very positive role model. So yes, we do have a variety of ways of tackling it, but obviously we do need all of these to work together.
Ged Grebby, how much of a priority is this for football's world governing body, the organization FIFA? There was a report in The Nation, which is a US publication last year. This was a report that was there last year, which said that despite complaints from players, FIFA is not taking the problem seriously.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think FIFA has done a great deal to fight racism within the game. They've done some hoardings around the ground saying no to racism, but there hasn't been an investment in anti-racist education campaigns like Show Racism the Red Card. I think that in England, the FA have done far more, and in Scotland as well, to challenge racism than FIFA have. But you know, what we're finding in schools here in England is it's not a problem that just comes from Europe. Donald Trump is mentioned more and more by our young people. Is that you know, how come the President of the United States can get away with racism? You know, if he can be racist against Muslims and against Mexicans, why can't we? So we're facing problems here in Europe because of statements the American president is making.
You can go ahead, John. I know you wanted to say something there. Is FIFA doing enough?
I don't think it's doing enough, but I think it's the word we haven't mentioned, which is quite important, and that's respect. I think we live in a world which has become very hostile and partly fueled by social media, which is, I'm not criticising social media in itself, but we live in a world where the banter, which should be healthy, has crossed the line, and I think partly fueled by social media and the mainstream media as well. There's a malice which has come into rivalry, and we've lost the days of respect. I mean, I remember standing on the Stretford end back in the 60s, and the days of Georgie Best and Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law, and when the opposition team did something good, you'd actually applaud them. But nowadays, we live in a world where people want to abuse the opposition, and it's very rare that we see respect between football teams. It's, you know, they'll take an overhead kick from a Ronaldo or a Gareth Bale in a Champions League match, which is very spectacular, to get genuine respect from opposition fans. And I think that is the word which we need to promote a little bit more, because I think if we respect people of any race, not just people from a different colour, I think it will start to improve the education that we need, and education is a key word. So I think we need to think more about respect.
Chuka, very quickly, I've just got a few seconds left. We've been focusing on racism in football, mainly in Europe, but what about other major footballing countries around the world? What about the Latin American continent? I mean, we've seen and heard racist comments, homophobic comments, and abuse being hurled at players in a country like Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the report that I was telling you that I looked up about a week ago in terms of how many of these reports come through, it includes South American countries. Yeah. And I anticipate this is really a global issue. It's not just Europe. It's a global issue.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Ananad Naidoo in Washington, D.C. We leave you now with a message from UEFA President Alexander Ceferin.
I'm ashamed to see lone individuals utter racist, sexist, and homophobic insults without realizing the devastating effect and symbolic significance of their words. I'm ashamed to see bananas thrown on the pitches. The people who do these things, each in their own way, trample on human dignity. They bring shame not only to football, but on the human race. They seem to think a stadium is a suitable place, where people can go to vent their feelings and express their unhappiness and misunderstanding of the world around them. That's why I am ashamed.